Good morning, everyone. Thanks all so much for joining us for our December Clear Up the Chaos. We're super excited to have y'all here, and Michelle has a full agenda for us. We're excited to have her back this month to speak on the hot topic. And just a few housekeeping things to remind you of. If you would go ahead and kindly mute your computer. And if you do have questions arise during her presentation, feel free to either send those via chat box. Those will come directly to me and I can vocalize those to Michelle. Or if you would like, when she's finished with each section, feel free to unmute your computer and ask those questions yourself. Just a friendly reminder, this event takes place the second Tuesday of every month, beginning at 10 a.m. And so we hope that you will make it part of your monthly calendar and join us. Our next Clear Up the Chaos is taking place Tuesday, January 12th. And Tamara and myself will communicate those hot topics that we are going to cover for the upcoming month in a few weeks. But just wishing each of you a blessed holiday season ahead. And I'm going to turn things over to Michelle. And Michelle, we're going to start off this morning with how to plan for the FFCRA credit.
Okay, great. Good morning, everybody. We hope you had great Thanksgiving. And as we are already well into December, don't get stressed like me. We'll work together and we'll get there. I want to start with FFCRA. There's a couple of hot topics on this. But one of the first things I want to start with is just an overview. I got a call recently and was surprised that there are still employers out there that don't know about the FFCRA. So that is the Families First Corona Response Act. And that is federal paid leave. That is currently in Texas, well, the only federal paid leave, and in Texas, the only paid leave. So this is a big deal. We just heard about an employer getting fined for back wages for one employee upwards of about $3,000 in a small town right here in Texas. I mean, you might think that we're not on the radar, or, your company is not that big, but this is a big deal to the Department of Labor. They have provided this. They feel it's their responsibility to help employees that might be impacted by missing work due to COVID. So they've provided this leave. Well, they've also got a website with their phone number and an email address where employees can report their employer for non-compliance. So there are fines and back wages that could be due as a result of non-compliance. So just in a nutshell, the FFCRA is the acronym, we like acronyms in HR, that provides for emergency paid sick leave or expanded FMLA. And a lot of people, when we hear FMLA, we think, oh, it doesn't apply to me if I'm under 50. But under the FFCRA, it does. So it's an expanded FMLA. It's number one, it's paid, and number two, it applies to companies that are smaller. So those are exceptions to the traditional Family Medical Leave Act. So it is providing for either 100% of an employee's pay for up to 80 hours for one of the reasons on the poster, which everybody still has to post. I've had a couple of people ask me if it still applies. Yes, it is still in effect until December 31st of this year. So the poster must be posted through that date. We do expect to hear some sort of extension, although we haven't gotten any details on that yet. So we do believe there will be some form of paid leave on the federal level required in 2021. The other portion, which is number 5, only reason number 5 on the poster, is the expanded FMLA portion. And that pays for up to 2/3 of your pay for an additional 10 weeks or up to a total of 12 weeks, depending upon if you used the emergency paid sick leave portion. I have a lot of clients that reach out with specific situations. my employee's wife was exposed or was positive, my employee missed work for this reason, or we made them miss work for this reason, and want to understand how it applies and what payment is due. You know, those details can be tricky, and it's fine for you to reach out and ask those, you know, specific questions. We're here to help. But I don't want to spend too much time on going through that. Just reach out to Elizabeth or ask questions at the end or email us if you want to know more about it. But what I wanted to talk about today was I wanted to focus more on the credits. So a lot of employers panicked initially. I'll go out of business if I'm paying people to not work. And if I'm paying for people up to 12 weeks, I'm going to just might as well shut my doors. Well, the government planned for that, and they said that you can get payroll tax credits in the amount, dollar for dollar, of what you have paid out to the employees, but they're requiring you to keep very specific, detailed records. Well, what you're able to do now is go ahead and file your Form 7200, and you can even get an advance payment. So instead of writing a check on your payroll tax liability, you can do this form now and take the credit, so it reduces your payment. So initially people were just paying their payroll taxes and then hoping to get the credit, which is, you know, could have been in some far off future time frame. But now you can go ahead and do it and get the credit so that you keep that money in your bank. Now, I do want a word of caution. You know, we're not CPAs or accountants, but there's lots of links that provide the information that you need to be able to file those credits. And Blakeman and Associates puts out an email newsletter also. And this is something that I expect to hit any minute now. Honestly, we worked on it yesterday. And it's just one way that we make sure you stay up to date. They'll give you all the links. And then Elizabeth, I can send it to you, and Tamara also after the call if you want that. But, you know, one of the challenges I've seen for employers on the federal paid leave side is we're all scrambling because this law was thrown on us. So there was a lack of a process in place with many employers, and consistency and having a process is key to be able to show compliance to any of the employment laws. So this one in particular, especially because if you can get the credit on your payroll tax liability, you should expect and have those documents ready to be audited, right? So that should create a little stress maybe. We recommend that you have a list of what you require from the employees. You have a process in place, a form that you use, and that you retain and collect the documentation on a quarterly basis. Don't stick everything in a file for the year end, because there's a lot of things that happen that you've got to scramble and get together for year end. So don't just put it off to another time and then have to scramble at the last minute. So, I mean, you can do it ahead of time, but this is something you would try to get on a quarterly basis as you're paying your payroll taxes. So the documentation to support the employee's leave that you've paid them for, if you keep it in a folder for the quarterly that matches with those quarterly payroll taxes, then you are able to just have everything organized at your fingertips for that set time frame. So that would be a recommendation that we would make as far as your documentation and keeping your records organized. The other thing is lots of employers outsource their payroll, and they think, okay, my payroll company is in charge of that. Well, number one, I would make sure that you know what they're doing, because there are payroll companies, there's PEOs, and sometimes what they're going to do for you varies by provider. So ask those questions. The other thing is get the documentation from them so that you have that in your records, because you're the employer on record, the one getting the credit. Let's say a year from now, you change payroll companies. Okay, and you have a delay, or worst case scenario, you're not able to access those records. get a copy now. It's always your responsibility to keep those records that pertain to your taxes that you've had. Don't just outsource it and say out of sight, out of mind, it's their responsibility. One of the things that we want to highlight is it is your responsibility as the employer to know what the laws are and to know when they apply. So just like FMLA or ADA, if an employee is out with symptoms, and we all know by now that COVID symptoms are more than just loss of taste and smell. It's broader than that. Could be, something that even seems like a cold or allergies. So whenever somebody is out sick and they're seeking a medical diagnosis, that is going to trigger this law. So we need to be sure that we're on the front end of that and we're asking those questions and communicating with that employee and getting the information from those frontline supervisors to HR that understands the details is also a big key area that employers need to focus on. I do see a lot of lagging in communication or miscommunication or misinformation on a supervisor level that then puts you in a position where you could be fined or be non-compliant with this law. So just keep that in mind.
So Michelle, a question that I think we need some clarification on is, so can an employer get tax credits? Can they get both tax credits and the PPP loan forgiveness?
Okay, that's a real good question. So originally everybody was scrambling to get that PPP loan, where if you support your documentation, you could get the loan forgiven. It's a very low cost loan. So, and that was government funds. So you can't double dip from the government on those funds, but you can get both. You just can't get both for the same payroll. So if you were trying to get your loan forgiven and you were producing payroll records from like May through July, then any of the FFCRA that you paid out from May through July, you can't then submit to get your payroll tax credits. Does that make sense? So if you're submitting it to get the loan forgiveness, you can't submit those exact same payroll records to get the tax credit. So if the end of your PPP loan timeframe was, let's say, the end of August, and you're paying out emergency paid sick leave in September, then you can get tax credits for that. Does that make sense?
Yes. I haven't received any additional questions, but I'll keep watching for those.
Okay.
But let's move on to our second hot topic. Can you talk on the current political climate and how employers need to prepare?
Okay. So, man, if this is not a hot topic, I don't know what is. And depending upon who you ask, there's, everybody has a different hope maybe for where we're going to be in the near future. So one of the things that I want to stress is that as an employer, you need to be prepared regardless. So right now, Biden has put out a lot of information on things. He's letting you know how he feels and what's going to be important to his administration. So just like Trump did, and he, one of his big platforms was immigration, we saw lots of new immigration staffing hired. We saw a resurgence of no-match letters and notice of inspections. So we knew to prepare. And the way that we prepared was, making sure our I-9s were in check. So under the Biden administration, there's a few things that he's discussed. One, he wants to continue to support employees. So that's one of the reasons we see paid leave, although both Trump and Biden did talk about extending the federal paid leave. The other thing is some companies, it's not a requirement or for new hire paperwork, but some companies want to have an agreement, like a non-compete, non-disclosure, non-poaching type of agreement that you give employees. Well, when you give those agreements, there's a few things you need to take into consideration. One is that you're giving that in exchange. Somebody is signing an agreement agreeing to not compete against your business, not take your employees if they leave, not disclose private information. And what you're giving them in exchange for them signing that agreement is employment. So it's something that was traditionally should have been done at, the new hire stage. The other thing is, and I've seen employers do this, is you should be limiting these agreements to key personnel in your company. So executives. So if you think of somebody that you don't want to compete against your business, this could be your marketing manager because they know the ins and outs of some of your things. It could be your VP of business development, your key executives. So those are people that you would give an agreement to. You're not going to give an agreement like this to a receptionist, an entry-level employee, a laborer, because those employees don't have that ability or access typically to your trade secrets and things like that. So these agreements right now are permissible, but the more restrictive they are, the more in question and challenged they get in the court system. So enforcement becomes a problem. So if you were to give a non-compete to a laborer, you can't go and work somewhere else where you're doing, this type of work. You can see how just on a practical level, that's too restrictive, right? You can't impede somebody's right to work or competition in the market. So if somebody leaves as a laborer and that's what they've done their whole life, or they're, accounts payable and that's what they've done, you can't restrict them once they leave your business for working in that industry for a year. So let me just back up and say a traditional non-compete, non-disclosure agreement is something where it says you cannot work and compete against me in this position, in this geographic region for a time frame, and typically a year is what's used. Now, where you see these agreements that get overreaching is if it's 2 years, 3 years or more, or if you've got so many areas. So if you would say you can't do that, you can't leave me and go do the same business in Amarillo, that's one thing. If you say Amarillo, Lubbock, El Paso, Houston, you become much more restrictive, and that's impeding somebody's right to work. So these agreements have always been difficult to enforce, especially the broader they are. But employers still like to use them as a deterrent. It's something that it's official legal looking document where you initial and both parties sign. It's written by attorneys, so it's really difficult for people to really understand the full scope of what they're signing. But, and the other thing is you have people sign all this paperwork in the hiring stage that they really don't read it. I mean, how many of us read everything we sign closely at that time? Or even, when it says you must accept the terms and conditions, how many of us actually read the whole thing, or all of our closing documentation? So this is like that. Well, Biden is saying that these agreements are just too restrictive, that they don't allow for fair competition in the workplace. And so his stance on it is that it stifles an employee's ability to grow, and businesses should have to compete for the employees and for the business they get based on what they offer. So he is saying one of his platforms is that this should go away altogether, that Non-poaching agreements completely gone, and non-competes should be very narrowly used, only for the most key personnel and only for something that is deemed like true trade secrets. So that is one way that he is planning to restrict employers. Another way, and so as an employer, you have to make a decision, what kind of measures do I want to put in place? Of course, we need to find what the final rule is on this, but this is just something you should be prepared for. So how do you prepare for it? Well, right now, you just need to be aware that it exists. You need to look at what you do as a business and see, well, would this even apply to me at all? And if not, then, you move on to the next issue of the day. And if so, then you think about, do I need to have this reviewed by an attorney? What is the best practice? What other steps can I take to limit the access to the information so that these things don't happen? Or better yet, what can I do in my workplace to make this a place somebody wants to be and stay and grow, so I don't have to worry about what could be walking out my door? So that's one thing. Another thing that we're seeing is, OSHA. We've heard about OSHA's general duty clause in regards to COVID. OSHA's general duty clause, for those that don't know, is, there's all kinds of regulations that are very specific about fall protection and trenching and shoring, and just any different standard, machine guarding, hazardous energy, lockout, tagout, HAZCOM. All those things are very specific standards that fall under OSHA. But there is one general clause that is thrown in there as a catch-all that says employers have a responsibility to protect employees from known hazards. So what we've all learned this year is that COVID is a known hazard. So that's why OSHA weighs in on COVID, on what you're doing as an employer to keep your employees safe, what you're doing to prevent the spread of COVID in your workplace. So they're looking at things like, what policies do you have? What safeguards are you taking? Do you require masks, questionnaires, temperature taking? Do you allow people to work remotely? How do you handle complaints when an employee has a complaint? How do you handle when somebody has an exposure or a positive? So these are all things that OSHA's now concerned about that you do, because OSHA is all about keeping employees safe. The other area that kind of overlaps into OSHA, but is not, OSHA is not all about work comp, but work comp does fall under, OSHA concerns and regulations. So when an employee is injured or has an illness in the workplace, an illness is not something, we think about on a general basis. We tend to think of work comp as somebody picked up something and hurt their back and now they have to miss work. But if you had a positive in your workplace and you didn't take the right steps to limit their exposure to other employees, and the contract tracing would prove that that employee or 5 of your employees got sick based on their exposure in the workplace, then that falls under an OSHA recordable. So what Biden is talking about is expanding that involvement from OSHA into the COVID pandemic area. So just like Trump hired more immigration inspectors, Biden has committed to hiring more OSHA inspectors. So more OSHA inspectors should mean to employers that I need to be aware of, one, what my OSHA responsibilities and requirements are, because once OSHA comes in, even if they're coming in to deal with a COVID complaint, if they see that you're violating lockout, tagout, or fall protection or something else when they're on site, of course, they're going to address those things too. And OSHA has the ability to shut employers down, levy fines, and, they can just cause employers a lot of concern and, on the financial side as well. So some of the things that Biden's talking about is protective equipment. So we all think about masks. So I guess it would be an extension of that, whether it's the face shields or plexiglass or things like that. But also administrative controls. That's the part that I was talking about with what do you do? Do you have social distancing? Do you ask questionnaires? Do you take temperatures? Do you wear masks? Do you limit who can congregate in your break rooms? All these things, allowing remote work, limited group activities. What do you do for housekeeping and sanitation? How do you handle a positive or something in your workplace? But also maybe engineering controls, like your airflow systems. What have you put in place to clean your air or to make sure that you're not just recycling the same air that everybody is exposed to? And also, of course, time off. So how do you manage time off? Of course, we've already talked about the Families First Corona Response Act, which pays for time off, but that pays for the time somebody has off, but how do you manage your return to work? So all of those areas have been mentioned under the Biden group as far as their improvements or just emphasis they want to put with OSHA during their term. So that means that you need to be thinking about all of those things. And if you don't already have a plan in place, then you need to be, thinking about one. And if you have a plan in place, then you should evaluate how successful it's been, where are your loopholes, and what you can do to tighten that up. Now, you may know that OSHA has been just inundated with complaints. And if you don't know, they have. It's way up in that top 5 number of complaints that have come in for COVID-related reasons. So this is a very big hot topic. And even though they've hired more inspectors, OSHA is also worried about exposure in the workplace, because if they send an inspector out to your business and then that inspector gets COVID, then it's, OSHA's workplace illness to worry about. So what they've done is they've allowed a lot of inspectors to deal with complaints remotely, which number one means they're going to be able to deal with more of complaints quicker. So they're going to be able to manage that. But it also means it gives employers a chance that if you have a plan in place that should be documented, they're going to email you, they're going to ask you for your response. If you've got your ducks in a row and you've got your plan in place and you can send off, those documents and your policies and, you know what you're talking about, then that's likely to go away, and then you can avoid OSHA coming out. If you're not able to effectively respond to the question or the notice with OSHA remotely, and then they come out, you have a larger stake in the game, because then they're going to look around and notice everything else. That's the fall protection. They might say your HAZCOM. They might say this is not safely locked out or tagged out, or this is a hazard. So they're going to be looking for other things, and that just increases your liability. The other thing about OSHA and any form of any agency underneath the Department of Labor is they have the right to interview your employees. So they're going to ask your employees, well, what is your company's process on COVID? Are you informed of an exposure? What safeguards do they take? So once they come out, it can really expand and increase an employer's risk. So once they do that, then you've got to worry about, do my employees know the right thing to say? Are my employees informed about what our procedures are? Because you don't get to select the employee they talk to. You don't get to select, I'm going to have them talk to my safety manager. They pull whoever they want and they ask those questions. So as you can see, not planning for this, not thinking about it, not taking it seriously could really cost a company a lot of money and a lot of headache.
Thanks, Michelle, for that information. So there's been some rumors circulating, and maybe you can clear this up for us on this call, but there's been some things being said that employer can no longer call an employee by he or she. Is there any truth to that rumor?
So, all right. So Title VII is the law that protects employees against discrimination. And as we know, we've got 8 general categories, but they've been expanded through the years and extended. So you're talking about race, religion, national origin, and sex. When you talk about sex, that has been expanded to include gender identity, sexual preference, pregnancy. So those things have have been for a very long time, things that we can't discriminate or treat an employee, differently because of. That, what pronoun or what reference you use has become a larger issue under diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And we've seen the different communities, that's become a big issue in this election, right? Does the LGBT community align more with this, with Trump or with Biden and those sorts of things? So when we think about an employee's rights, we have to realize we have to go a step further. So number one, I don't believe most employers would treat an employee differently because of their race or their age or how they identify, but other employees might, and an employee might feel like they're being treated hostile in the work environment because they have a different sexual preference or a different gender identity. So employers should have annual harassment, diversity, and inclusion training. Diversity and inclusion are go hand in hand. It's about, respecting our differences and the fact that we all bring something new to the table and including everybody. So if you think about diversity, you could think about a band, right? And somebody getting up, that's the singer or the guitar player or the drummer. Each position they have that, think of that as diversity. Well, when you have just the singer, it's not as rich of an experience as listening to the whole band and all the instruments play together. So inclusion is when all those instruments come together for the overall experience. So extend that to the workplace. So inclusion in the workplace means everybody has a seat at the table, everybody, especially in this remote environment, needs to be included in the Zoom meetings, everybody, realizing that studies show that the diversity, the way we're diverse in our backgrounds, whether it's religion, socioeconomic, education, any of those things, could bring some new angle to a situation and improve our problem solving and growth at the company. So being considerate of calling somebody a he when they identify as a female or vice versa is an extension of that, right? Trying to make people feel inclusive and not mistreated in the workplace. So there are a lot of companies, mostly you will find it in the larger companies, that ask employees on a Zoom meeting or if they have to sign in, or in just a general communication, how do you wish to be referred to? What is your preferred pronoun? Do you want me to say, Bob, he recommends this? Or do you want me to say, she recommends this? Or do we want to be just very careful to use, how we refer to them so that it's not awkward, so that it doesn't make somebody feel less than or not included or harassed or discriminated against? So that has been there, but this is something we're hearing much more about. Now, whether or not it would be a requirement under the Biden administration, I'm not sure yet. We don't know, but it is still something that we should think about in the workplace because those laws exist. They've existed before. They just might be something that we focus on a little bit more now in the court systems. So let's say just an overview of the way that it works, since I think we're okay on time, is if you had a complaint from an employee and they went and they filed an EEOC complaint on you and they said they were mistreated or discriminated against, retaliated against based on their gender identity. So the EEOC could decide there's something to this based on your response, and they can also make it a much bigger deal and go after this topic. It could be an emphasis for the EEOC, and that or is it being, a requirement right now? It's not. But you should think about that. And if things like if your policy manual says he or she, back that out to employee and they, or if your memos say that, just think about how you're coming across and are you being inclusive? Witch hunt, but you might want to think about that.
So a question has come up. So if an employee does contract COVID, does the employer have to then notify all the other employees within that organization? How does that work and look?
So you have to, if an employee comes down with COVID, you have to look back and see who they were in contact with before they tested positive. And close contact is one of those things that the CDC has defined and then redefined. So, the guidance has been somewhat of a moving target, but an employer, that's guidance. That's not a requirement that the CDC is putting out, but you should be aware that you should not be doing something drastically different than what the CDC puts out. So having said that, close contact is now a total of 15 minutes. So instead it was, close contact for 15 minutes or more in one exposure. So that would be like if I saw you, if we congregated in the lunchroom. Well, if we congregated in a lunchroom because I was getting mine and you were getting yours and then we went our separate ways, but we chit-chatted for a while, even if it was 10 minutes and then I saw you again at the copier and it was, 5 or 6 minutes, then that's now considered close contact by the CDC. So an employer has to get with the employee and ask them who they were exposed with. And especially if it's like a driver and a helper riding together in the truck, to do the work, that's definitely going to be the close exposure. So you want to notify those that have that exposure, and it could even be a vendor, it could be customer, if they've had that close exposure to a positive. But you have to be aware that it is also somebody's medical information. So that's private. So you have to maintain confidentiality. So some people think it's splitting hairs, especially when you have a small office. They know the person's gone, but you say, well, an employee has tested positive, so I need to inform you that we've had an exposure in the workplace. I need you to monitor for symptoms, and you can't work if you have any symptoms at all, whether they're COVID or not, because we don't automatically know that right away, but we want you to monitor for symptoms. The other thing is that depending upon the exposure, there should be, a quarantine considered. Quarantine information has also changed. Used to be it was, immediately 14-day quarantine. And an employer can still do that and be a little more, conservative in their approach because, as we heard earlier, they're the ones kind of on the line for OSHA and these other fines and such, but they still have a business to run too. So CDC has said that a minimum of 10 days, or if there's, of course, if there's been no symptoms. And then 7 days if there have been no symptoms and they test negative for COVID after, a few days after the exposure. So it can't be immediately after the exposure. There needs to be at least, I believe, 48 hours before you test, because we need to give it time to develop. But that's a good question. So you want to notify people, and then you want to take the necessary precautions with the people that have come in contact with them. And that's why, so much emphasis has been placed on remote working. There are some counties, even like Harris County over here is very different from Montgomery County. They've come out and said, we major emphasis on working remotely. They send out text messages to people that have signed up for notifications. We're in the red zone, so we recommend that everybody work remotely. So, thinking about these things. And then if we decide that we want as employers to work remotely, because let's say somebody that was exposed to that positive employee doesn't have symptoms, but they're still within that time frame when they should be quarantined. And you know what? Their job can be done remotely. So what kind of controls can I put in place as an employer so that I can still manage the workload, so I can still make sure my employees are being productive? Because the FFCRA, emergency paid sick leave pay part, does not kick in when an employee is working. It kicks in when they're missing the ability to work and earn income for that reason. So you don't have to pay them for sitting at home if they could work from home. So these are things that you should be thinking of. So you do notify, you just don't tell them the name of the person. And you should have kind of a routine thing that you say, this is what that means. We don't want you to come in if you're sick. To return to work, you need to do this. I would just say we recommend you seek medical guidance, medical advice, because you want to kind of remove yourself from that position. So you want them to check in with their physician and have somebody else tell them what they need to or should be doing.
Thank you, Michelle, for answering. So I know back in October, one of our hot topics was, of course, on mental health. And I know that still is a hot topic, considering the holidays are here and people are wanting to see their family. And that just looks a little bit different for everyone's safety this year. So can you kind of speak on that, on the mental health of employees and what that kind of looks like for an employer?
Sure. So mental health is one of those things that, we don't really like to talk about so much in the workplace because it can be uncomfortable or difficult, or we might feel like we're prying, but it is something that is protected in the workplace. As much as a physical is, as we learned with, or as we know with OSHA, an injury could be a physical injury or it could be an illness. Well, it's the same thing with, under FMLA and ADA. It could be a physical or it could be a mental impairment or a reason that triggers protection under those laws. So it is a very real thing in the workplace, and it impacts productivity and morale, safety, and then, like I said, it might trigger action on an employer's part under one of those laws if it applies. So it is something that we need to think about, and we need to be trained on and aware of what we can and can't do or say at the supervisor level, and then of course in the HR level. So depression is spiking as we work remotely, as we face an uncertain economic climate, changes in the leadership of our country, layoffs, holidays, even on a good year, are difficult for people. But on this year, I don't know if you've seen those trees that are made of toilet paper with the Grinch, 2020 stink, stank, stunk. I mean, this year has just tested us all to a whole new level. So it is natural that this is going to spike more than in, healthier years. So you've got people that are dealing with illness, isolation, separation, uncertainty, anxiety. All these things create create more uncertainty and more a depression. Now, whether or not something is going to be classified as a clinical depression or something, it still might be an issue that you need to be prepared to work with in the workplace. So one, realize that there are some legal protections out there. Two, just address it like you would any other issue. If you have an employee that used to be super productive and is now making all kinds of errors and not producing or not communicating, hold them accountable to the same things that you hold everybody else accountable to. Don't be afraid to address it because you're concerned that they might be going through a hard time. Give them the opportunity to tell you that maybe that's going through a hard time. You know, you could say, hey, I've noticed, you know, you're making a lot of mistakes or your productivity isn't what it was. And we need to talk about that. This is what I need you to do in your workplace. Is there, you know, something that you want to share with me or some way that we can help you do your job better or work with you to get this done? And then just open those lines of communication. So the employee might say, I am going through a difficult time. I'm thinking about entering into some counseling, and it might mean that I need to leave early or come in late on a couple of different days. That would be something that you would accommodate, and that should cause you to think about ADA or maybe FMLA. The FMLA, as I said earlier, traditional FMLA is 50 or more employees, but ADA, which is Americans with Disabilities Act, it's been amended over the years, and so disability has broadened. Just like we saw Title VII coverages get broader, we've seen that under ADA, and that's 15 employees or more. So, and that requires employers to make a reasonable accommodation if an employee is able to do, if doing so would enable them to do the essential functions of their job. So a way that you show compliance to this law is just engaging in what they refer to as interactive process. So that just means communication. You're speaking with the employee, you're asking them what's going on, you're asking them what they need. You are aware that something is going on, and then of course you have to be aware of what your legal obligations are as an employer of your size. So we just want to be aware that this is out there, that it's more prevalent than it might have been in the past. We want to be aware that we may have a legal responsibility to employees that are impacted on this side of things. And we want to be aware that, you know, anxiety, PTSD, depression, all of those things fall under mental health. And so just checking in. And, you know, when we have people working remotely, we tend to be, you know, out of sight, out of mind. But checking in with those people on a regular basis, just like you would to build those relationships in the workplace, that should be something that you do with your team that's working remotely. But do not accept poor performance or violations of your policy just because it's might be an uncomfortable topic. You know, we need to shed some light on it. We need to be, you know, empathetic and see what we need to do to help. But we don't just want to stick our head in the sand and pretend it's going to go away, because things can escalate, and we don't want that to happen.
Perfect. Thanks, Michelle. So we have about 10 minutes to address this last topic. So can you speak on year-end recording, the record keeping and the retention best practices and requirements that you recommend our employers that are on take part in?
Okay. So at the year end, a lot of us do some, you know, housekeeping, cleaning, purging. So when we think about purging, that extends to our documentation, and it can be a very important job for a company that has a lot of turnover. So we want to look at, you know, what is a company's policy on this. So each document that you have in the employment setting may have different requirements. So FMLA has one, tax documents are another, I-9s are another. So you want to look at what is my responsibility for each specific type of document. And then most people, you have an active personnel folder, and then when somebody terminates, you move it to a different filing cabinet, or if it's electronic, a different section, and that's your terminated folders. So you want to keep, because you might have, all those documents that relate to the employee with different timeframes, you want to look at the longest time frame that you have and say, okay, I'm going to keep my personnel files, I'll keep terminated files for maybe 6 or 7 years, because that's going to encompass everything. And then you need to have a process in place that you manage consistently so that you are on top of it. One of the things that we do recommend are I-9 audits be done annually. And I-9s are one of those documents that we recommend you do not keep in the personnel folder. In fact, we recommend that you actually have 3 binders or 3 folders, depending upon the size of your company. If you're a big company, you want to have a binder so that you can access them quickly. If you're a small employer, 15 or so, you can keep them in little files. But you want an active, an inactive, and then I call the third folder, or binder, which is new to some people, action. So active means you are required to have an I-9 on file for every employee actively working for your company. ICE can come in and request to see your I-9s. And just like OSHA can come in, they can see more when they come in. So we don't want to go through personnel folders and sift through and say, okay, I know it's in here somewhere. We want to limit their time with our company, and we want to show them we've got our ducks in a row. So we want to just hand them the binder and the payroll printout. They can also look at your inactive I-9s. So you should have a binder for those. So when an employee terminates, you should have a process where you are pulling them from your active binder and moving them into your inactive binder. So one of the things that we recommend is putting a sticky note on top of the I-9. So sorry, I'm so aware of when my nose itches or something these days because of COVID. I'm sorry, I turned my fan on, so bear with me. But when we have an I-9, after somebody terminates, our retention requirement, you have to think a little bit, and each one is going to be different, because for the I-9, it's not a set, 6 years. It is 1 year from the date of termination, or 3 years from the date of hire, whichever is later. So if a 5-year employee terminates, I only have to keep it a year from the date of their termination, because they've been with me for 5 years. If somebody that's been with me for 1 year terminates, then I don't keep it a year from the date of termination. I keep it no less than 3 years from the date of hire. Okay, so that's a lot of math for you to do, and there's not just one quick way to do it. So we recommend you put a sticky note on the top, or if you have an electronic record keeping system, then you can set up those parameters, and you can use technology to help you there. But basically, you're going to know what the date of hire is, what the date of termination is, and what the date of destruction is. Sounds scary, date of destruction. But you don't want to keep I-9s longer than you have to, because most employers have mistakes on their I-9s. And if you had ICE come in and audit your I-9s, they can fine you upwards of $700 per I-9. So multiply that out. There are fines that can be levied against just one I-9, thousands of dollars. So you want $1,000. So you want to, number one, know how to do this process, know what your requirement is. You want to audit so that you are sure that you have an I-9 for everybody on your payroll. You want to have a destruction process so that if you hand your ICE investigator your active binder, you don't have 10 terminated employees on there that have mistakes on their I-9s, right? Because each one of those mistakes could be a fine. So that's important. Then we move them to the inactive binder with that sticky note on the top. And then when we purge that inactive binder, when it is time to purge. Now, you could shred them or put them in the personnel folder and then file them away for your time frame that you keep all your records for. But keep in mind, you want to have a process in place. You want to manage it on a regular basis. Don't wait until at the end of every year when you're scrambling to do whether open enrollment or your taxes or all of that stuff, or even summarizing your OSHA log, which you have to post every February through the end of April. You need to post your OSHA log. So you don't want to be scrambling to do all these things at the end of the year. So keep up with it as you terminate or on a quarterly basis to purge your I-9s. You also want to have a log of who you've purged, right? So you want to have an employee's name, their date of hire, their date of termination, the date of destruction, the name, title, and signature and date when you destroyed the I-9 and the person who did it. Because let's say you accidentally, like let's say they come here and you can't find an I-9 for somebody. It may be that you forgot to take them out of your payroll system, but you had them on your destruction log, and oh, this is why we just forgot to turn them out of active employees. So this sort of documentation is important for you to have.
So a question has come in. So if an employee's been working for an organization for 3 years, do you destroy the I-9 or not until after the termination date?
You have to always have an I-9 on file for any employee that is actively working for you. So you're going to have an active binder, and everybody working for you, whether they've been there 1 year or 10 years, must have an I-9 in your active binder. Now, only when we terminate do we move them to the inactive binder, and only once they've met the retention requirement do we actually destroy the I-9. So it must be kept longest period, either 1 year from date of termination or 3 years from the date of hire once the employee's been terminated. Do you see what I'm saying? I hope that clears it up. I know it's tricky. That's why I like to use the sticky notes. So you'll get into the habit of date of hire, date of termination, date it should be destroyed, and you're actually going to do the math. In some cases, it helps you do the math. You could do date of hire plus 3, and then put that date, and then date of termination plus 1, and put that date, and then circle the one that is the longer of the two. Okay, so you always have it for employees. You terminate and destroy only once they've separated from your company.
Thanks, Michelle. Quick hour. We had lots to cover. I'm going to follow up with everyone with the video recording if you want to share it with anyone within your organization. I'll also follow up with that newsletter that Michelle referenced. It's going to be going out today. I'll make sure and get that forwarded to each of you so you have time to look that over. And as always, if you have any questions or if anything comes to mind after this call, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Tamara, and we will put you in direct contact with Michelle. She's a wonderful person to have in our back pocket with lots of knowledge, and we're so thankful for her. Like I said, please mark your calendars for our next Clear Up the Chaos, the second Tuesday of each month. The next one's taking place Tuesday, January 12th, and we hope that you will join us. If you're interested and know you already want to participate, feel free to go to our website and go ahead and just sign up like you normally do. And the login information will be sent to you at a later time. But if I don't talk to y'all between now and Christmas, I hope you have a blessed holiday, and I look forward to visiting and working with each of you again soon. Thanks so much. Y'all have a great week.
Okay, bye.
Bye.